Thanks, Hugh, for inviting me to share this discussion with Kevin, with you and the school and the students. It's 30 years since Kevin and I first met. It was 30 years ago that Kevin became the 4th ever winner of the Pritzker Prize for Architecture. He followed Luis Barragan, Philip Johnson and Jim Sterling. And when he won the prize, the AAI, through Tony Reddy, who had worked in Kevin's office, and I wrote to Kevin to say we'd like to put on an exhibition of his work if we could. And he facilitated us to mount a full retrospective exhibition which toured the country but had its principal opening in the Douglas Hyde Gallery in Trinity College, opened by the Taoiseach at the time, Charlie Haughey. And Kevin also gave a lecture that year to the RAI conference in Killarney, ably supported by his wife Jane in the presentation, which was a masterclass in how to show what an architect does. The lecture was in 2 parts and lasted 5 hours, and the hall was full to the end. So by comparison, this is going to be a quick scamper. Just to set the scene, Kevin was born in Dublin in 1922 to a political family. His father was a Sinn Féin TD elected to the first Dáil, but in Kevin's youth, early years, the family moved to Mitchelstown, where Kevin's father managed the co-op and turned it into Europe's largest creamery. So I'd like to start, Kevin, by asking you, with a background like that, why did you decide to study architecture?
That is an impossible question to answer. Because nobody, an architect, who wants to be an architect? You know, nobody ever heard of it when I was there. And indeed, I didn't. I went to Rockwell. I was kind of interested in, for some reason, we had a big loft in our backyard, and I was always building things in it, and for some reason or other. And when I went to Rockwell, I discovered the 7 Lamps of Architecture in the library, which is the other thing.
Ruskin's book.
And we had a half an hour private time in the study at night, and so I used to do little drawings. And I was doing a drawing one night of a church, because of course that's all we did all the time. We prayed and went to church all the time. So I was trying to think of what building would you design, so I designed a church. And I had in this incredible epiphany, I designed the church in the shape of a cross in the plan. And I got so excited, I couldn't believe it, you know, but I believe it was this enlightenment and all that. And when I was going to the dormitory that night, I told my best friend, he said, "You're stupid." He said, "Don't you know every church is in the shape of a cross?" It hadn't occurred to me. Suddenly it came that way. But one thing led to another, and I was a terrible student. I failed everything. In every class I was over. When I was in the local Christian Brothers, I went to get I was sick for a while, and I went to get my year report. This was when I was about 12 or so. And the Christian brother came out and he gave me this thing, and I looked at the list as I was walking on, and they had the honor students, and I wasn't on that. And then there were the pass students, and I wasn't on that. And then there were the failed students, and I wasn't on that. And then there was the local sort of village idiot. This was a poor guy who was about 20 years old, and walked around pulling a little wooden toy train behind everywhere. And so that's Imuna. And then there was Kevin Roche. I didn't even qualify to fail.
But you made it to UCD.
I made it to UCD.
And what was the school like then? What was the teaching like?
My father drove me up to Dublin, and we went into Earlsford Terrace, and they put a £20 note on the little counter. And I was signed up for the architecture school. And the architecture school then was very small. There were only 11 other students in the year I joined it. And it was in an old building that had been built for one of the Queen's visits to Dublin in the 19th century, I guess. And there were plaster casts of various monuments around the world, but the center of the whole thing was filled with sand, because they were filling sandbags because the war was just beginning and all that thing. So we had sand grid everywhere, you know, drawing, and there'd be little layers of sand on your drawing as you're going through. And it was Rudolf Maximilian Butler was the professor. I told the story earlier, but when we went in, we were brought down to his office, which was in the basement, and we were all waiting for the message. You know, the professor was going to the message. And he said, "There are no plums in architecture." That was the end of the message. So that wasn't a very good send-off. But we spent our first year learning all the details of Greek Revival architecture, because that's really what he was interested in. And Ireland
he was the designer of Earlsford Terrace, wasn't he? Where the school was. Yeah.
And it was, of course, Ireland was totally isolated during the war, and we had no books in the library. Nobody had heard of Le Corbusier or anybody like that. You know, there was no communication. And in the second year, things began to change a little bit, and in the third year, we were finally beginning to realize there was something called modern architecture. And the only reason we knew a little bit about it because a couple of the students had been in France before the war, and so they knew. But there was absolutely nothing in the library, nothing you could learn, you couldn't look up anything up. And so it was all kind of invention. Gradually, though, we began to realize what was going on. And by the time we graduated, we had some peripheral, very vague knowledge of modern movement, which wasn't that old at that point in time, maybe 20 years or so. And we all graduated pretty innocent, I think, of what was going on in the rest of the world.
You were a pretty talented group. I mean, in the year before you, there was Pat Scott. In your year, there was Robin Walker. And then there was a maverick, Dan O'Herlihy.
And Danny O'Herlihy was in
whose father, whose son is Lurkin O'Herlihy, is a well-known architect in Los Angeles now.
Yes, I know, yes. And Danny was also had little bit parts in the Abbey while he was at school. He was playing that.
And did I understand he entertained the class and you did his work for him? Or is that a myth?
That may be part of the lore, but I don't remember.
Yeah.
Kevin Fox was there, Wilfred Cantwell, and several other Ken Kirsten, very talented people who all happened to be in the school. And some of them had sort of fled Europe. Some of them had fled England, so it was quite a mixture of people, even though it was very small, a small group.
And while you say that there wasn't, certainly in your early years, much knowledge of international work, your own thesis was for a president's residence,
Yes.
which I think today we'd call the Taoiseach's house.
Right.
It was the president of the executive who would be the Taoiseach then.
Right.
But it shows influences from Le Corbusier and from the Pavillon Suisse.
Well, there was, yes.
How did you know about
I
these?
discovered the Corbu school in, where is it, in Switzerland? But
In Paris?
Or entrance.
Yeah, in Paris. Yeah.
So
Yeah, but it's the Pavillon Suisse, yeah, the Swiss
I
Pavilion.
stole that and used it.
And then after graduating, you worked briefly with Michael Scott. You worked on the 3 CIE buildings, yeah?
Yes, I got a job as a lecturer, and I just remember this, lecturer in UCD. I was teaching in Bolton Street. The lecturer was £2 a week, and Bolton Street was £2 a week, and Michael Scott was £2 a week. So I was actually earning £6 a week, but I was working about 12 hours a day. And Michael was wonderful. He really was a fine architect, and he had a lot of young architects in the office, and we all kind of stimulated each other, you know.
Kevin Fox and Wilf Cantwell and these people. Yeah.
And there was a Danish guy who kind of ran the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then Michael, I wanted to get the hell out, so Michael introduced me to Maxwell Fry, and I went to London for a while. And in London, I was leafing through a architecture magazine, and I read something about Mies van der Rohe, and I decided that's what I wanted to do, was to go and study with him. So a year after that, I applied to IIT in Tower in Yale, and for some incredible reason I got accepted. Also, Fred Hilton and I, we didn't mention Fred, went to Chicago to study with Mies. And that was quite an experience. It was really wonderful. He was a very large, slightly grumpy man, but very pleasant. And he didn't say anything at all. He practically said nothing in the whole time. But he was quite an influence, and we were asked to design a house for ourselves. And of course, every house had to have a flat roof because that was all part of it. But I decided perversely that I'd put a pitched roof because it was snowing like hell in Chicago. And you know, I was wondering what the hell are you going to do with all that snow on top of the flat roof. So I put a pitched roof on it. And Mies came to my desk and he looked at my drawing and my pitched roof and he said, "You could do that, but I would not do that, you know." that was the final dismissal.
Because you didn't stay long. You didn't stay as long as you had intended.
Well, I figured I'd got the message, you know. How long
So after that, it was New York, and you were working on the UN headquarters building.
So I got on a bus and went back to New York, and I had very little money, and I got a job at the United Nations because I wanted to work. The United Nations Under Construction had just been formed. I really wanted to make a contribution. This is very ambitious, and I wanted to make a contribution to world peace. And I thought if I worked on the UN, that would be something. So I got a job and at the UN as an office boy. They wouldn't hire me as an architect. But after about 4 or 5 months, they finally put me on the drafting table. And
Was this with Wally Harrison, or?
Wally Harrison and Romovitz. And it was on the site of the office was on the site of the final building. So I actually saw the building going under construction.
And then you'd build 2 major landmarks within sight of it yourself later in your career, but...
Well, I didn't know I was going to
do that.
So I didn't do it.
So, Aerosarin, how did that come about? I mean, why would you be attracted? If you were initially attracted to Mies and that discipline and that rigor, why would you go to someone like Aero?
I was in New York for about 6 months, and I totally broke. I was on the bump. And I had a friend who happened to know Aero and knew that Aero was looking for people. And I had a cousin called Kathleen Ryan, who was briefly a movie star of sorts, and she had got a job with MGM, and she had come to New York, and she had an MGM expense account, so we went out drinking for about a week, and we were on El Morocco and all the various clubs around New York, and this girl that I knew set up a date for Aero to interview me. He was in the Plaza Hotel. And I'd been up all night, and I went up to his room. He was getting dressed for the interview. And I sat on the edge of the bed, and Aero had a very slow delivery. And I finally fell asleep. And I wake up and he'd be going on like I'm going to wake up now. And I didn't really want to go with her because I'd seen his father's working at Cranbrook and I didn't particularly like him. But he hired me for some reason which I'll never understand. But he did hire me, and I got my last few dollars. I got a train out to Birmingham, Michigan, where his office was, out to actually Detroit. And then got a bus up to Birmingham, Michigan, and started work, but I hadn't been to bed at all. And that night, somebody led me to a boarding house. There was a Mrs. Looney on Purdy Street, and she had a room for $1 a night. And so that's what I was there for about 6 or 7 years.
Now, when you went, Aero had just won the commission for General Motors, for GM Tech, which was the biggest project in the world in the 1950s.
It was $100 million at that point.
In the 1950s. And he had an office. You were about, what, 10 people when you came in?
Yes, and it got to be 105 or so.
Yeah, and other people who were there in your time were Cesar Pelli.
Oh, he came later.
Later, yeah. Robert Venturi.
They all came later.
They all came later. So you were in on the ground floor.
I was in on the ground floor.
So what was your job with Aero? Because I mean, you were chief design assistant, I think, within a few years.
After a while, but the first job I had was to do a rendering from Brandeis University, and I couldn't do a rendering, so I scribbled all over the drawing. And Aero didn't see it, and he got on the train and went to Brandeis to make the presentation. He discovered this thing I had done, and when he came back, he said, "Fire that guy." So I was fired, but he took me back again. And so then we got to know each other, and we established a very good relationship. I did a lot of the detailing at General Motors, and he was very good. He let
and
you.
How did it work? I mean, did Aero make sketches and pass them down the office,
He
or?
did, and then we could come back with alternatives, and he would come back. That was a good relationship. He was absolutely wonderful. He was a brilliant, brilliant architect, and he was a very strong sculptor, and he could draw beautifully with everything.
But you have said somewhere that you spent almost 24 hours a day with Aero. It wasn't like a normal relationship. Can you talk a bit about that?
And Aero would come in at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he liked to work till midnight. And he worked every day, and I remember one day he was complaining because there weren't enough people in the office. And I said, "Well, you know, it's New Year's Day." And he had no idea. He was absolutely focused tremendously, as if he knew he'd only have 11 years to live, to do it all.
Yeah. But you say while he was focused, I mean, he could lose the big picture a bit, yeah? I mean, you used an expression once to me about if you put Aero in a field or something.
Oh, yeah. I always thought if you put him in the field to plough the field, he'd dig a hole. Because he had that sort of intense
and
focus.
Your job was to keep...
I tried to keep the old plough going. And I would keep, bring him focused in on various projects, because there were a lot of things going on.
But then, I mean, working in Detroit must have been extraordinary. I mean, it's where the slogan was, where today meets tomorrow, where the ideas of the arsenal of democracy were kind of being worked out.
Cranbrook had a big influence on the art field in Detroit, and Charles Eames, Charles and Ray Eames had been Cranbrook, and there were a lot of similar, George Nelson and that who had been there. So it was a very lively, from a design point of view, it was a very, very lively place to be. And the interesting thing, there was no catalogue of parts. In other words, if you wanted a door handle, you had to design the door handle. Anything, you couldn't just go to the catalogue and buy it. You had to actually design everything, every detail. And that was kind of a great experience, But the only thing you get from a catalogue was toilet fixtures. The rest of it
but then your client was the automobile industry, and you learnt a lot from that and brought several innovations into architecture for the first time in your practice through GM Tech. I mean, neoprene gaskets never existed in architecture before.
John Dinklow was very, very technologically focused, and the idea of glazing. The cars were glazed with neoprene, and so he decided, why couldn't you glaze a building in that same way? And so that was really the first time that was ever used. The 5-foot module was developed. And I think that seems incredible now that you have to develop something like a module, but it's true. And the idea of high-rise office buildings laid out on the basis of a 5-foot module throughout the whole building, you can move it. The movable partition was developed, and all of these things, the metal partition. Before that, it was just all sheetrock. So a lot of things were developed then.
And you also did full-scale mock-ups, which I think hadn't been done before. And I think there's an amazing photograph of a staircase outside your office, I think, which is part of the St. Louis Arch,
Yes.
which is like a full scale of part of the...
Yes, we did. I encouraged the idea of the models because that Earl had a sculptor's mind, and it was easier for him to see things when they were rendered in 3 dimensions. And it was then easier for everybody to understand when should a big monolith, everybody could focus on it. People fumbling through working drawings, you know, with architects don't seem to realize that the rest of the world can't read drawings. and you know, they draw quarter circles all over the place, which is door swings. And somebody's looking at their house and they see all these quarter circles. They have no idea what is it. They have no idea what that is. So we managed with the model to be able to communicate.
And then with John and his interest in technology, I mean, there are a couple of other innovations I just want to mention. I mean, Corten steel used in architecture for the first time.
We were drinking with Kevin Fox one night, and I got this idea, why the hell wouldn't you build buildings that would just rust and fall down after a few years, so there'd be more buildings to do. And so I was kidding with John, I told him that. And he got the idea of, you could use a rusted steel. And he went down to Pittsburgh, play steel, and as it turned out, they had just developed the Corten, which they were developing for high-rise wire structures for holding up transmissions. Yeah. So John got into it, he got them interested, and they went to Pittsburgh Steel, and they ran the things as I-beams and WFs and all of that stuff. So he really started the whole business in Corten. And
at IBM, reflective glazing?
And the reflective glazing was something, and I hate to say this, but I proposed that too. And that was the idea of the mirror. And why couldn't you we were going to do a building for Allison Jet. It never happened. And we showed it as reflect. But then gradually John got interested and developed the glass to be energy efficient and all of that. So there's all of those things.
And then you were going to move in 1960-61 to Connecticut, to beside Yale, and in the middle of the move, Aero suddenly died at the age of 51.
Yes.
And you were what, 40?
I was in
39?
In 19, what you were?
Yeah, in 1961, you're 39.
39, yes.
39, and you were a famous architect, but you weren't a registered architect.
No, I wasn't even a citizen. And I was going to get married to Jane, but as it turned out, the week Aero died, so we had to postpone it for a couple of years. And that was difficult.
So that was an enormous responsibility, because there were, what, 9 or 10 major projects on the boards or on site, and you had to finish them.
But you know, the nature of the office is such, we just settled down and did it. I was at a meeting in New York with CBS, and we were talking about the number of elevators and all of that stuff, and I got a call, and I went into another room, and the caller said that Errol had just died. I decided what Errol would do is he'd come back into the meeting. So I went back in the meeting, we finished the meeting, and then I told him, you know, and it was that was the nature, we just went for it.
And those buildings that you had to finish out included the TWA terminal, Dulles Airport, St. Louis Arch, CBS in New York, and a whole bunch of others, which you finished within 5 years.
Yes.
Meanwhile, trying to set up your own practice. How did you weren't a partner in the firm when Aero died?
No.
John was?
John and I were very close, so we had broken off at one point in time. We were going to start our own firm. And Aero found out about it and almost fired both of us.
But then you had to do that at the same time as finishing Aero's buildings.
At the same time.
Aero had been on the list for interview for Oakland Museum.
For Oakland, and we decided that we would, fine, went to them. And I had this idea, looking at a site, a map of Oakland, there's Lake Merritt, and then Oakland was built on one side of that, and then it looked out to the bay. The connection between the lake and the bay was an area where the new building was going to be. But I decided it shouldn't be a building because you'd be blocking this seemingly natural connection between the two. and what it really needed was to be a landscape place. And so we managed to convince the mayor of Oakland at that time was Irish, crazy guy called Houlihan. And of course he attached to me a little bit, so that helped. And
but I think to say that that was the reason maybe is to underplay something else that's very important in Oakland, because you made these amazing gouache drawings of the plans for Oakland.
Yeah.
I mean, like diagrams rather than architectural plans.
Yeah.
And then you photographed them on slide film. And
Yes.
you made the first ever slide presentation, as I understand, or you're credited with inventing the slide presentation in architecture, which is like PowerPoint 40 years before PowerPoint was conceived of.
You start, again, it was that whole thing of people just don't understand what thing you're talking about when you're waving your arms and pointing to line drawings. So you have to start at the beginning, explain what it is now, explain what you're thinking has been, what the various alternatives are, and you show what the various alternatives are. And then you gradually narrow it down until you reach the point where it seems that this is inevitable. It has to be your design. This is the only thing that could possibly happen is what you're presenting. So that's where you want to end up. You know, that you just can't wave your hands and
can I talk just about that a little bit, about persuading clients and handling of information and that sort of your research-based methods of design, which come out of systems analysis, which started in the military. And I know that Aero, during the Second World War, was in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA, and that he was head of the Visual Communications Department of OSS, and that he designed the White House War Room. And how much, I mean, were you guys, even in the 50s, were you in on this way of thinking before anybody else?
I can say, but I think we may have been very well. We may have been. I didn't know anybody else that was doing it. Because the traditional way is you get a job and you come back with a design, and the owner says, "Okay, let's go," and that was it. Nowadays, you don't get the job. You keep looking around for the job, finally. Then they say, would you mind doing a number of schemes? They don't say for free, but that's what they mean. And then, so then they have 10 architects each designing 4 or 5 schemes for something, and then put together a commission of people. They look and they decide to do this. And then, so then you get hired. And then you start to design, and they say, well, no, we're not going to pay you until we have an approved design. In other words, by this time you're out of pocket by more money than you have. And so finally you get the design and they say, okay, that looks pretty good. And then you go to city planning, then you go to the community board, then you go to all the oddballs who are saying this, you can't build there, you can't build there, you can't do anything. And finally, it all gets resolved. But it's been twisted a little bit. And so then you try to get twisted back into shape again, and then you get going, and then you go through the whole process of doing the documents, and the contractors and subcontractors and the bidding, and then you get into the construction, and the contractor do this, and then the thing starts to leak, and then something blows off, and then something else falls down, and then the door swings don't work.
But the presentation certainly worked. And 2 other projects that were kind of fundamental around that time were Ford Foundation. I'm wondering how you came up with the concept of an office building with a garden embedded in it. And was it, were you making a deliberate strike back against the Seagram building, which had established the plaza, and you were re-establishing the street line?
No. I never liked the idea. There was a thing that happened in zoning in New York where that if you created an open plaza, then you could add more space to the building that you were building. And Seagram's, of course, did that, but they didn't add the additional space, and they created this big plaza. But plazas are big empty spaces. Nobody fills them in the plazas in New York. And Errol did not do that at CBS. He put the building in the center of the plaza, and we got into a big argument about that. But what I was interested in at the was the need in the human mind to connect with nature. And I have the greatest sympathy in the world for people who work in office buildings. It's got to be the most boring world, and it's even more boring now because all you're doing is staring at this stupid computer all day long, and you know, communicating back, telling dirty jokes back and forth or whatever. and the amount of work that gets done is minimal, and it's all coded and everything else like that. Boring. So what do you do for the people who are working in offices that gives them a little bit of relief, how do you create a sense of community? How do you give them some connection back to nature? How do you make their lives just a little bit better than it is in typical high-rise building? Those people who work in high-rises are condemned to hell. It's a hell up in the air, you know. Who wants to live like that? You got a few years to live. You want to sit at a stupid desk all day long and, you know, complain about what they're paying you, complaining about things too close to us. You know, you want to create something which people really feel a little bit better, contribute a little bit to their nature of what they want. And it's without getting confrontational, without doing anything else like that. I think our role is to try and improve the lot of the citizen in whatever way you can do it. And one of the ways you can do it is bring in a few trees, and a few fountains, and a little bit of relaxation, and some relief from the pressure of work and your boss on your back and all that stuff.
You've been very good to Yale University, your neighbour. When you won the Pritzker Prize, you donated the prize money to establish a chair of architecture in Aero's name.
Yes.
You donated it to Aero's archives and later your own archives to Yale. But you've never taught, as far as I know. Why did you not teach after Dublin?
Well, I never had any time to do that. It takes time to do it.
It takes time. And I hope you don't mind me asking, but how do you feel about being a member of what Izzy Metzstein called the Rubble Club? Architects who've had their buildings demolished in their own lifetime. And I'm thinking in particular of the New Haven Coliseum.
Yes.
How did you feel when that was demolished in the last few years?
I wish they demolished it instead. They blew it up, which is even worse. But that was an interesting political situation. The mayor of New Haven, who was also Irish origin, which didn't hurt, he was very ambitious to create a new Haven and to bring a center of conventions and all that sort of thing.
You met him on a plane?
I met him on a plane, and we had established good relationships. I did several buildings for them. And he started this idea of the convention center, and then we did that, we developed it. And then he retired, and before the building was finished. And the building was something like, it was projected to be 10 million, or perhaps 11 million dollars, and it came in at $12 million. And the succeeding mayor didn't like Mayor Lee, and the board didn't like him because they felt he was too aggressive, he'd done too much noise. So there was no support for it. And after a while, they just dropped the whole. So they didn't create the management for it. They didn't.
So it was in trouble from early on.
It was right from the beginning. It was in trouble. It never really. They had.
To find out about it, you should check out the issue of Perspecta called Monster, published about 2-3 years ago, which has a lot about the Colosseum, including photographs of its destruction, and an interview with Kevin. But I'm under pressure, Kevin, to wrap this up. We have barely touched, as I said, 45 minutes was going to be a bit of a scamper through this.
I realize I'm talking too much.
But I want to kind of end really by echoing what Bob Stern said recently about you in Washington at the Building Center, when he said that you carved out your own territory in modern architecture, in the third generation of modern architecture. And the areas to which you made unique and original contributions, which are shared by all architects today, have to do in the field of building typologies. We've got Oakland and we've got Ford Foundation. The Federal Bank in New York, which wasn't built, was a skyscraper on stilts with a plaza below it. New Haven Coliseum was a sports stadium with a car park over it. You developed the ground scraper, really, at Union Carbide, and I wish we could have talked more about that, which pre-heralded developments in Silicon Valley. There's technology and all the new materials that you brought into architecture. There's your design methodology, which involved interviewing hundreds of workers, for example, at Union Carbide before the design process began. There's your concern for the environment, both in real terms and in symbolic terms from the very beginning of your independent career, and presentation techniques. And on top of it all, you are the only architect that I know who has been able to complete his master's work to the satisfaction of the entire architectural community and world, and then carve out an equally brilliant individual career. You're an honour to the School of Architecture and to UCD, Kevin. And I'd like to finish just, you said that at the start, you'll have a word then before we finish. You said at the start that you went to the UN out of a sense of idealism, that you wanted to do something for world peace. And I noticed that the last line, I remember the last line of your Pritzker Prize acceptance address in 1982 was, and this is coming after the Cold War and all of that, to say, to build well is an act of peace. So before everyone thanks you, Kevin, you want to have the last word as usual.
I just have one quick story. When I was in my third year at UCD, we were asked to design a house, and I designed a house which had in the shape of a cross, and in the center I put a spiral stairs, and I really got focused. I'd never seen spiral stairs like that, and it was all standard wood and things like that, and I worked it out very carefully and all that, and I was so proud of it. And Matty McDermott, who was the
taught me too in the 1970s.
Yeah, came along, and I was sure he was going to love it. And he looked at it, and then he said, sure, you'd never get a coffin down those stairs. I thought, this is outrageous stuff. But then it dawned, of course, we got to get coffins out of everywhere, because that's what our future is. And so
Not too soon.
It led me to this philosophical chant which says, we're here for a purpose. In architecture, your purpose is to make a contribution to the well-being of the community, however you do it. But don't ever forget that that is why you are architects, that is why you are here. It's not to be architects, it's not to make all, twist everything, turn it all. You can do that too, but you have to make a contribution to the well-being of the community, because otherwise you have left nothing behind. And we'll just take your coffin and push it out of the window.